Hello, Gavin here, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing a little bit of a different video. Usually my videos are aimed really at bass players, but this one's aimed at musicians in general. As many of you may know, I'm a bass guitar teacher. I do also teach guitar and theory on its own as well. And something that does come up a lot, not just with bass players but with guitarists as well, is whether theory is actually necessary. I do have many students who really enjoy learning theory and who are interested in learning theory, but I do often get that question, do I really need to know this? So this video is my answer to that as a teacher, from my perspective, and really why I think that theory is so important. This video also might dispel a few of the myths that people often question when it comes to theory. So let's get stuck into that now. One of the big common questions about theory is, will it kill your creativity? A lot of people wonder this, some people believe it, that it'll actually ruin their creativity to know more theory. And while I can understand where they're coming from with that, I really don't believe that's true. Think about when you learn a language. If we learn to speak English, if we're learning to put sentences together, we're learning the theory behind it, how to construct words, how to put sentences together, punctuation. We'll learn all of these elements so that we can speak. But having learnt that, it hasn't held us back. If anything, we are more creative. We can improvise a sentence, we can have a conversation without having to analyse every word we use and question whether it's the right word or not. We can just talk. Music's the same way. With music, if we learn the theory, we're understanding the chord tones, the choice of notes, our scales. We can converse musically with other musicians without having to question whether we're right or wrong. And this is the big thing with theory. It's not about knowing the theory and using that to create. We can of course use theory to write chord progressions, solos, melodies. There's nothing to stop us from doing that. And it's a good way of doing it if we are, for instance, stuck for ideas or we're in the studio and trying to come up with something. We can do that. But really the value in theory comes from having this vocabulary built up so that we can create freely. We're creating from what we want to play, not from knowing what notes work and which ones don't. It's building these things up so that our hands go to the notes we want to play and we can play from the heart or from feel, whatever you want to call it, and create something musical and creative, and use the theory as a source of explaining it to another musician, as a source of understanding what another musician has played. But really it all comes from building up that theory knowledge in the first place so that we can create freely as a result. One good example of how this can be applied is the major scale. It's one of the earliest musical scales we learn, and often we overlook it as soon as we get into more complex playing. But if we apply music theory to that scale, we'll learn that it's so much more than that. For one thing, it's the centre of understanding key signatures, chord tones, the chords that work in a key, the major scale obviously, but then also it gives you some pointers on how to understand minor scales, the modes, more advanced theory like that. All of that can be derived from the major scale. And it all comes with just applying this theory to the major scale and understanding it fully. Another common question is, does theory mean reading sheet music? And actually they're not the same thing. I'll give you a good example of this. This is going a little bit more bass player specific again, but many of you might have known of a bass player called Pino Palladino. He's probably one of the biggest session bass players in the world. He's played with massive artists from The Who, John Mayer, some amazing artists. I first heard of him because he played bass on one of my favourite Gary Newman songs, which actually is the reason I play fretless bass. So I'm a big fan of his work. And I remember seeing an interview with him talking about how he doesn't read sheet music. But that doesn't mean he doesn't understand theory, because for one thing, his bass teacher was Joe Hubbard. He's actually done an interview, well, a vlog, about his time teaching Pino Palladino on his channel, which you should really go and check out Joe Hubbard's channel, because some really cool stuff on there. But he talks about teaching Pino Palladino the theory behind everything he was playing. Pino was one of those players that knew how to play some fantastic pieces, could play some fantastic patterns on the fretboard, but didn't have the theory knowledge at the time. and Joe Hubbard taught him that. So there's a perfect example of how they're not the same thing. For me, I think sheet music still can have an important role to play. In fact, I did a video about that quite a while back. I'll link to that down in the description. Really, theory is something completely separate to that. There are elements of theory that help with reading sheet music, and vice versa, but they are separate things. Another common point about theory is people will say the greats didn't need to know it. And while it's true that a lot of great musicians don't understand theory from an academic standpoint, they've trained their ears. Because you think about musicians like Chuck Berry and the countless other amazing rock and roll artists. They were playing a 12-bar blues, not because they understood the theory behind the 12-bar blues, but because it sounded really good. That is the sound of rock and roll, and they didn't understand that theory. But the reason we know that all those chord progressions are a 12-bar blues is because someone understood the theory and explained what they played. Theory allows us to go back and look at the music that these great artists created and understand it and figure out how we can learn from it and adopt it in our playing to create something unique. And although maybe a musician might not understand the theory, if something sounds good, it can definitely be explained using theory. And the other thing is that we can create something using the theory quicker than the person stumbling through chords trying to find the right chord progression they're looking for. For instance, I could write a song using theory and get there in 10 minutes. If I know what key it is and I'm kind of having an educated stab at what chords would work for me, because I know what chords work in that key. If you don't understand that, it'll take you longer because you have to go through the chords, figure out what chord's right. If it's not the right one, try another one, try another one, and try another one, until you find what works. The process of elimination is much quicker if you know the theory behind writing a chord progression. And this is not to say that what the greats did back in the day isn't valid because they didn't understand theory. Far from it. That music that was written is incredibly special, and we don't have modern music today without it at all. It's so important. But at the end of the day, they created it because their ear was good for what they were listening to, and they built up these chord progressions by putting in effort. We today can understand it by applying the theory. And something else I discussed there about playing by ear. If you want to play by ear, you want to learn to play a song by ear, one of the main ways you can make that process easier is by understanding theory, because the theory helps with picking out right and wrong notes, understanding the difference between major and minor. If you're trying to figure out a chord progression and know what key it's in, you've got some better starting points to figure out what notes would be right than just trying the whole fretboard. So why would you actually need to use theory? Well, we've already talked about ear training, that it can be a good starting point for making that process of figuring songs out by ear much easier. But then it's also good for using things, like we said earlier, major scales, understanding how to use scales. Scales can be a great thing, but if you're just learning them as patterns, you're not going to get the full benefit of them. So understanding how to use a major scale, how to use it to find chord tones, what are chord tones, how to find out what chords work together, things like that. Theory helps with all of these things. That of course then leads into writing better bass lines, better solos, better melodies, better songs, because you have these elements, these creative tools to use and create better music. Then of course have things like jamming with friends, being able to improvise a solo, a melody, being able to improvise music in general with friends. That's a great thing to be able to do. It's a lot of fun, and theory can be a massive help for doing these types of things. Like we said, understanding the songs that great musicians have written previously, understanding why that song works and what's so good about it, why the chord progressions work, things like that. That all comes from understanding the theory. Then of course you've got things like transposing, changing the key that the song's in. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a singer and had to change the key to suit their vocal range, or we've been playing a gig and I'm playing a song that I know but I'm jamming with a different band and they play in a different key. I can't expect them to change the key to suit me, so I have to move my bass line that I've already learnt to a different key. That's all things that you can learn to do by understanding theory. But now that we understand all these benefits of theory, the next question is often, isn't it really difficult to learn theory? And really it's not any harder than any other aspect of playing an instrument. It just takes time. Don't rush it, take your time with it, and start with small amounts of theory. You don't have to learn all of music theory in 1 week. If anything, that's going to be a horribly boring week. I'm not going to lie to you, theory isn't always fun to learn. But taking a small amount of theory, for example, you could start with the major scale. As I said earlier, there's loads to learn using the major scale, but you don't have to learn it all quickly. You could learn your chord tones from it first. And then you could start writing chord progressions. Start trying to put all that together. There's no right or wrong with this, and theory just takes time to learn. But just make sure you take small amounts of it, just very small amounts of theory, and get it into your playing. Don't learn it academically and not use it, because really you learn music theory not to know the theory, but to have more fun playing an instrument. It gives you the skills to have even more fun playing. And the more theory you understand, it'll get more enjoyable learning the theory, because it's not always going to be such a big hurdle as it is starting it. Starting to learn it, it feels like there's so many topics to get stuck into, and you've got so much to learn in a short space of time. But it's really not the case, because once you get the basics, the more advanced stuff isn't that much harder. You just gradually build it up and build it up. And when it comes to learning theory, you're not on your own. There's loads of books out there, there's videos on YouTube. This is of course more of a discussion of whether you need theory or not, but there are videos all about theory from some great musicians online. There's also of course online courses, and you could study with a teacher, whether that be in person in your local area or online. You could take Zoom lessons on theory alone. I do that. I have students who come to me to learn theory, so there's nothing wrong with that. You could take those types of lessons. But the important part of all of this, regardless of what way you go about it, is making sure that you still have fun when you're playing, because music's always meant to be about having fun. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and of course this is just my opinion, so I'd love to hear what you all think on this. So please let me know down in the description what you thought of this video, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. Just let me know what you think about this topic, and any ideas you have for people who want to get into learning theory as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe down below. Click on the bell icon to be notified of more content when it comes out. And until next time, keep working on those bass faces.